USA, 1985 AD. It has been 3 years since the battle. An evil messenger suddenly appears. My power is the fear of mankind. With destruction and terrible death, there's despair in the skyscraper. To fight against the evil dictator, a man appears from the darkness. His name is Ryu Hayabusa. Jakio has not yet been awakened. Yeah, sure, that loosely makes sense there, game. Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Play Ninja Gaiden Shadow. Been a while since we last did a one-off LP off the top of my head. This is the Game Boy's Ninja Gaiden entry, sort of. There's a little bit more to it than that, but let's not mess around too much. Let's actively get into the game with Stage 1. So mechanically, this is pretty basic Ninja Gaiden. You run around, you slash with your sword, you collect an Ninpo to actively use your sub-weapons and all that, or sub-weapon more actively. While mainline Ninja Gaiden as early as 1 actively had Ryu have multiple sub-weapons across each adventure, in this you just have the Flame Wheel Ninpo where you throw 2 fire wheels upwards at diagonal angles. Otherwise, you just got your basic sword and that's it. Most enemies take between 1 and 3 shots to kill, and from there getting through the stages themselves is going to be actively pretty straightforward. With that said, worth noting, Ryu is noticeably missing one specific part of his toolkit from the major NES trilogy at least. And that is anything regarding wall mobility. You see, in Ninja Gaiden 1, you can at least cling onto a wall and then jump off of it, and in Ninja Gaiden 2 and 3, you can climb on walls to begin with no matter what. In this game, Ryu can't do that. He only has his basic jump for upwards mobility, with exception to that claw I just used. By pressing up at the jump button, Ryu will shoot a claw upwards. You can use that to cling onto certain rods, which you can then use as platforms that you can either jump up or hang off of with down the jump button as well. And as weird as it is for him not to be able to do stuff with walls, the grappling hook itself feels fine, but it definitely isn't a very Ninja Gaiden feeling mechanic, is it? Well, there's potentially good reason for that. The thing is, the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy, as well as the SNES compilation trilogy cartridge, were all developed internally at Tecmo themselves. But this game's a little bit closer to the Master System game that was actively developed by someone else. I'll talk more about that in a moment though, because it's time for our first boss. This boss is named the Spider. He spends a lot of his time on the ceiling crawling about. When you get directly below him, he'll usually dive down on top of you, but he can also do a diagonal jump downward to just try and land on you outright. When he's on the floor, he does move back and forth a little bit, but he's not too aggressive down there. Keep your distance on the floor, use some Ninpo if you have it, just to get some cheap hits when he's on the ceiling, and ultimately he will die eventually. Though worth noting, this game's bosses do feel like they have a good bit of health, not for nothing. With the only real exception being maybe the final phase of the final boss? Maybe? Worth noting, for as famous as the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy is for its cutscenes on the NES, as well as the Master System game Not For Nothing, this game's only cutscene are the intro, the ending, and that scene at the end of every single stage exactly like that, with just the boss sprite changed. So getting back to the point I was talking about before, the spider fight. This game is a lot like the Master System game in that it was developed by someone else. While most of the series up to this point was developed by Tecmo, the Master System version was developed by Sims, who also I think did the Dreamcast version of House of the Dead 2, the Genesis, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie game, alongside a couple of other things over the years. But this game was not done by them either. This game was actively developed by Natsume. As in Power Blade 1 and 2, Shatterhand, Super Nintendo Spanky's Quest, Pocky and Rocky's earliest entries, the Super Nintendo Power Rangers games, the Game Boy GBA era Metabots, Div Team, Natsume, not to mention their co-development efforts on certain Kirby titles. The key here, though, is that Natsume also developed a game I did another one-off LP of about 2.5 years ago now called Shadow of the Ninja. The ledge grabbing, and even though it's not in that game off the top of my head, the grappling hook by extension are very much more out of that game than Ninja Gaiden. And there's good reason for that, seemingly. This game, as best as anyone can tell, may have started development as either a Game Boy port or follow-up to that game, rather than being a Ninja Gaiden entry. This is supported by, getting a little ahead of ourselves here, this game's final boss theme just outright being a slightly changed up version of the final boss theme from Shadow of the Ninja. Oh, I should probably also talk about this as well. When I was recording the footage for the Shadow of the Ninja LP back when they announced a remake of it, Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, that came out I think in early 2024, I want to say. I still have yet to play that. I'll probably do an LP of it after I do, though, mostly just because I like ninja platformers. It's probably, in terms of games I generally like to play, one of my top 5 genre types in general. Counting like Mega Man likes, Metroidvanias, and Castlevania likes all in there alongside just the general concept of RPGs. But I think there's just something about that's just a very fun pace for me to actually pick up and play at really any point in time. Getting back to the game though, Stage 1 wasn't really much of note in terms of its mechanics because it really was just a straightforward platforming level. This one does add in some conveyor belts to complicate things here and again, but they're seldom a problem. Though we do meet one of my least favorite enemies in the game here, the guys that put up a shield. You can't hit them through the shield. I think even the fire Nimpo won't go through the shield correctly, but the timing of when they put down their shield, I can't tell to this day after my first playthrough if it's a factor of just timing for them to put their shield down, or if it's you looking away from them. It feels like it's more the latter, but I can never quite tell. Also, this game really likes to not quite spam enemies, but they're definitely very smart in kind of a mean way about where they place them, to the point where there's times where it feels like you really can't react to an enemy's shots coming on screen correctly at some points, especially in the later stages. Though that's another factor where I can kind of squint to go, yeah, this was probably another Shadow of the Ninja project at one point, as Shadow of the Ninja notably has several weapon types you can select from, and some of them actively have a lot more range, so those enemies would be a lot less annoying to deal with. But because we're stuck just being Ryu, and that's when we only have the Dragon Sword, we're kind of limited on what we can actively deal with. Bosses, plural, for Stage 2 are Jack and Gregory. Jack is the little guy who's going to bounce around like a Fleaman from Castlevania, and his only goal is to make contact with you, because whenever he's on top of you, you get slowed down tremendously. That leaves you open for Gregory to come up and punch you directly. Gregory is pretty tall, but you can use the platforms to get above and around him. Just be careful, because if you're up there too long, he will actively punch upwards to try and damage you. He also has a charge attack that I can barely ever read. I think he does it almost every time he punches Gregory back upwards. But otherwise, use the platforms to get around that, and you should be fine. You might be able to eat a couple of hits and get through this fight pretty safely. Worth noting, while it's not as gameable as certain other mechanics and other Ninja Gaidens or otherwise, most of the boss patterns in this game have something about them you can game to get around them very easily, but it really just depends on the boss in question. That's Stage 2 all wrapped up. Moving into Stage 3, we actually have my favorite song in the game because, well, it's just another version of Unbreakable Determination from the first Ninja Gaiden, and I adore this song in any way it shows up. Though not for nothing, as much as I didn't really vibe with Ninja Gaiden Ragebound on a mechanical basis here and again, its soundtrack is incredible, and its version of Unbreakable Determination is easily the best one the series has ever had. It's not even funny. Oh my god, that soundtrack is so good. Stage 3 has 2 primary mechanical focuses. Fire bars of 2 types, ones that rotate and ones that just go straight up a wall, which are notated by a specific sprite on the wall's edge, as well as platforms that move up and down you need to watch out for, which are largely easy to get around, but not for nothing, if you rush too much, it is easy to fall into a bottomless pit. Also, worth noting, the grappling hook can go much higher than you ever think it really can. It can't reach the ceilings if you're like, say, where Ryu is right now, and the ceiling's all the way at the highest point it can be, but if it's any lower than that, you're probably going to be able to reach it in most cases. At this point, though, because frankly, the game's intro does not do a very good job of describing what's going on in the narrative here, let's read this game's story as it's listed in the manual. Let's go back to a point in time 3 years before the historic battle with Jakio. In 1985, the Emperor Gulf suddenly appeared, and the terrible death and destruction began. People's fear and despair only makes me stronger. It's time for all the people in the world to bow down before me. Just when everyone had given up all hope of resisting Gulf's overwhelming strength, a lone shadow appeared. His name was Ryu Hayabusa, the last of the Dragon Clan. Of course, Ryu had no way of knowing that the evil Emperor was an underling of Ryu's arch-rival, Jakio, despite the fact that he wasn't even his arch-rival yet. They hadn't even met yet! That's technically as far as the story synopsis goes in the manual, but the page after that's just an entire Legend of the Dragon Sword segment I might as well read as well. This Ninja Gaiden Shadow is a story from a time 3 years before Ninja Gaiden, back to Ryu Hayabusa's training years. Ryu had not yet polished his skills. The only ninja technique he had mastered was the art of the fire wheel, hence why there's only the one sub-weapon. However, he was firm even then in his love of justice. Since then, Ryu had been involved in many adventures including the Dragon Clan's Dark Sword of Chaos and the ambitions of Jakio, But these stories will have to wait. Compared to those battles, this story is just an opening chapter. Use your skills to open the curtain on this chapter of the Dragon Sword legend. Translation? Yeah, this was not originally planned to be a Ninja Gaiden, more than likely, so we don't even have an actual story for it. We're coming up on the final part of this stage here, and the final hazard here is a lot less dangerous than it looks. Specifically, it's going to be a spiked ceiling that starts collapsing as you get underneath it. As long as you hold the D-pad to the right and don't hesitate, you're going to get through this just fine. It's not worth trying to get the item capsule below there, though. That actively contains an extra life, which are handy in this game. But not for nothing, this is also probably the easiest classic Ninja Gaiden by extension, if only just because there's so little to do outside of boss fights. Speaking of which, boss fight for stage 3 is Colonel Allen. This gun-toting soldier has 2 attacks, both involving his gun. When you're on the floor, he's largely going to try and just do a dash across the floor, firing downwards as he goes. But if you're on the ceiling, he will stop in place and fire diagonally upwards at you. Thus, you can just easily game this boss by getting just slightly above him, waiting for him to start firing upwards, and then getting a slash or 2 in while he resets his pattern. Overall, probably the easiest boss in the game in my eyes, if only because his pattern is just so much easier to figure out into game. Not for nothing though, if you don't intentionally eat some hits just to get some extra damage in yourself, this can be one of the longer boss fights, if only because you're just stopping so much more often to wait for him to do one thing or another. In the meanwhile, I'm going to start going over this game's dev staff, at least the people we actively know the identities of and the aliases they use in the game itself. For instance, this game only actively had one programmer, who is listed as DFS Kotobuki, but their actual identity is Toshiyasu Miyabe. Their early career is a bunch of special thanks notes, namely Shadow of the Ninja, Shattered Hand, and the game based on Chojin Sentai Jetman, but they also programmed for the Game Boy version of Spanky's Quest, Pocky and Rocky 1, the Ninja Warriors, Wild Guns, the latter 2 Mighty Morphin Power Rangers games on the Super Nintendo, the Japan-only Gundam Wing Fighter on the Super Nintendo, and programmed the early Gundam Battle Assault titles. Most recently, they were the programming director on Shadows of the Ninja Reborn, the Ninja Saviors, a sequel to the earlier mentioned Ninja Warriors, as well as Wild Guns Reloaded. Stage 4 is probably my least favorite stage in the game, if only for a single segment in the very first third of it that is representative of one of my least favorite mechanics in platforming history, a mechanic I started to actively hate via an earlier Ninja Gaiden title on the NES. Specifically, once we get past this segment of dripping pipes, ninjas that throw tracking shurikens to your location, and effectively robotic crows, we're going to enter a cave segment. During the first chunk of this cave segment, it's time for some good old darkness platforming. With that said, I say darkness platforming, this is more like darkness avoidance. First off, flashing lights warning over about maybe the next like 30, 40 seconds. Future me probably already put timestamps at the start of the video and right about now as it is. But the room is gonna flash dark for a few seconds before flashing back to light. You don't have to do any jumps over bottomless pits during this though, instead you need to watch out for these things, which are lasers. You can only avoid the lasers by being on top of or underneath the platforms you can hang from. You can tell where the platforms are going to be by either waiting for the room to flash with light for a split second, or actively either looking at where enemies are standing or where the lasers are already being fired to and being blocked from. With that said, we're already out of that segment. It doesn't last very long. Honestly, it almost feels like they just didn't know how to make an entire stage out of that, potentially, which is probably the case if I had to guess. But instead, we're going to have to deal with something else for the latter, like, third of the level or so, because we're thrown into a trapped bottomless pit that they conveniently put a giant restock point of right here. Got an info and 2 health pickups. Yeah, they want me dead, but they want me dead by their own hands, not by the fall. I mean, come on. This here is easily the game's most dangerous room. It's a giant vertical shaft. That's an auto-scroller. We're being chased by lava. If that touches you, instant kill. Thus, you need to make a mad dash here. There are some of the patrolling trap mines we've seen since stage 1 that leave a fire pillar when destroyed, but the real threat here are actively these, I guess, electric pulse generators. As while they don't damage Ryu, they do keep him in place for about like half a second to about a second, and that is way more than enough time for that lava to catch up with you. That little U-bend we just went through right there is easily the most dangerous section of this stage too. Because if you played the early segments of this room badly, the lava will easily catch up to you there, and if you don't go over the U-bend before it catches up to you, you're just dead. I also don't know of a way to really avoid the laser that fires down there without just taking a hit, so I always just tank a hit. With that, now we're on to the stage 4 boss fight, which is another relatively predictable fight. This is the evil nobleman Hokusai. His 2 attacks are either raining a spread gun of shuriken down in your general direction below him, or getting on floor level and then throwing his fan like a boomerang. You need to duck under it on its way from him and then jump over it on the way back. You can potentially eat a hit here and then just keep hammering on him while he's waiting down on the floor, but you want to be a little careful. Save some Ninpo for this fight as well, as since he spends enough of the fight up in the air, getting a cheap hit in on him with that once or twice at a time can really build up in his health. Going back to the game staff, the graphics team for this game is made up of PCT, BBB, Keek Natsujio, as well as M Sigi Sigi. We know none of their identities as far as I'm aware. One of them does have a Moby Games page, but this is their only listed credit, so shrugs. With that, welcome to Stage 5, the final stage in the game already, and it's definitely the longest and most dangerous stage at large, as they throw up pretty much every enemy in the book at us, on top of a lot of new ones along the way. These flamethrower enemies in specific are another one of my least favorites in the game, as they are very relentless with their firing, and whenever their barrage ends, if you're within a certain distance, they'll just immediately begin another one, so you either need to use a fire Ninpo to take care of them from a distance, or just eat a hit and hopefully you can get to them in time. Thankfully, and not for nothing as well, this game does also give you Ninpo charges at a pretty good rate, so while I'm a little bit more conservative about using them, feel free to use them at a moment's notice in the case you're getting into a tight corner or there's an enemy in an awkward position. If you're at max charges for them, or even just 4 charges, feel free to use them to get yourself down to like 2 and save those for a boss fight potentially, as they can really help you. I like to save them for boss fights largely, but that's just because a lot of them spend a lot of time in the air if you haven't noticed that thus far. 3 out of the 5 bosses largely do. Next up in the game's dev staff as we go through this stage, though, is the sole sound team member Hiroyuki Iwatsuki, credited as Dawn. He started as a sound designer for Tailgater on the Game Boy and has been involved in various projects doing music and sound work since. Shattered Hand, Chojin Sentai, Jetman, Wild Guns, Pocky and Rocky 1 and 2, the 3 Super Nintendo Power Rangers games, at least Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I think they may have worked on the Zeo Racer game as well. The 3 main Gundam Battle Assault titles, the PS1 Dr. Slump game, the DS Kamen Rider Dragon Knight game, all are projects he was on alongside Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, Wild Guns Reloaded, and Eiyuden Chronicle Rising. Easily the largest set of credits, as was pretty prevalent in this era that the game has to offer, is its special thanks segment, namely it credits Aikazu, Shun, Tam Tam, Taru, Tom, Futaro, and Utake-san. We know the identities of Aikazu, Shun, and Tom specifically. They are Kazuhiko Ishihara, Shunichi Taniguchi, and Tomoyuki Nishiyama, respectively. Kazuhiko Ishihara seemingly did some work as a programmer, namely being listed as such for Shadow of the Ninja, Shatterhand, and the first Pocky and Rocky, but largely the rest of their credits, as few as there are still, are special thanks segments, namely being thanked in this, Tailgater, Chaos World, the Jetman game, Mitsume Gataro, and the Ninja Warriors, which are all Natsume projects, so I'm assuming they were just someone else at Natsume who pulled programming support effectively. Shunichi Taniguchi's in a similar state, but they did a lot of graphics, illustrations, and design work for Natsume, being on the graphics team for Shadow of the Ninja, Shatterhand, Wild Guns, the early Gundam Battle Assaults, as well as being a chief designer or planner on games like the Super Nintendo Fighter for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Pocky and Rocky Reshrined, Shadow of the Ninja Reborn, and Ninja Saviors. Finally, Tomoyuki Nishiyama is another graphic artist for the company. They started with room design for Amazing Penguin on the Game Boy, but also did graphics for Tailgater, the first 2 Pocky and Rockies, as well as SCI Special Criminal Investigation. This elevator segment, by the way, represents the final platforming challenge in the room, but make sure you come over here to grab this health pickup, as at the top of this elevator lies the final boss, and you're probably going to want to be topped off as best you can in both health and Ninpo for this, as it is easily the longest fight in the game. It's time for Emperor Galv himself, or I've heard he's actively also called Emperor Garuda in some state, which is also the name of the villain from Shadow of the Ninja, so hey, another connection there. He's gonna sweep from high in the sky to the floor and then just start raining down lightning bolts as he slowly ascends. And once he reaches the top again, he's gonna swing back and forth across the screen, firing a couple of extra ones before starting his pattern over again. Rinse and repeat, attacking him when he's down near the floor or using Ninpo until you reach phase 2. Not for nothing, again, flashing lights warning here, as every time he does fire his attack, he does flash the screen black and white, and while not the most intense pulsating, again, better safe than sorry. I don't really do so here, but I could really recommend in my own experience actively using more of your Ninpo in this phase than phase 2, if only because it'll end this phase quicker since he's out of your reach for so much of it. But at the same time, saving it for phase 2 would also let you skip through that phase a lot more quickly, so it's really just your mileage may vary on which one you find it more comfortable to be on. Just make sure you actively use it. I can't quite recall if I do super well. There's times where I just kind of forget I have it, because now for nothing, the Fire Wheel Ninpo is not one I've really gone on my way to use a lot in the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy. I'm either using the Spin Slash or some of the Shurikens, especially with the Shadow Clones in Ninja Gaiden 2. But hey, it comes in handy here and again, just not being the only sub-weapon. In phase 2, he transforms into a robot. At this point, he's going to land on the floor and stay on the floor for most of the rest of the fight. He's going to spawn 3 projectiles, a tile in front of him, and then jump to either the extreme side of the screen or to the middle, at which point the 3 projectiles he spawned in will move in the direction they're facing, starting with the middle, then the bottom projectile, then the top. At that point, his pattern loops. Stand about a tile away from him and duck and do slashes until the second projectile moves towards you, at which point jump over it and then get into the new position where he's going to go next. And from there, you can get through this fight very safely. This is personally why I prefer to use Ninpo in the first phase if I use it at all, if only because this phase is a lot easier to game because you don't need to worry about which direction you're going in at all times, but, you know, mileage may vary. With that said, that's a game. That's Ninja Gaiden Shadow. It's alright. It's obviously just a lot less mechanically in-depth than any of the 3 NES Ninja Gaidens, as well as even the Master System game. I can't bring myself to say it's bad, though. It's just kind of unremarkable, but not boring. It is an interesting game while you're playing it. It's just a lot less mechanically dense or interesting than any other game in the genre, largely at this point in time. With that said, it is better than some of the early Shinobis, at least the console ports of them. But in comparison, if you're looking for like a good ninja platformer on early handhelds, I'm gonna recommend the 2 Game Gear Shinobis over this by a pretty big margin at that. What's kind of funny too is that's kind of how I felt about the game since I first played it, because I didn't talk about my history with the game prior. If memory serves, I first found this game by just, again, scrolling through early emulator sites at the time and just seeing a Ninja Gaiden game on the Game Boy. I went, ooh, I know I like Ninja Gaiden. Then I played like 2 stages and went, this is fine. And then moved on to something else, largely. There's a really big part of me that can't help but think if this game actively had become a Shadow of the Ninja port or follow-up, then it probably would have been a more interesting game because the different mechanics that Shadow of the Ninja has from Ninja Gaiden would have much better translated to the Game Boy than them trying to translate and simplify Ninja Gaiden's mechanics. It's a bit of a shame that's not how things worked out, but oh well, frankly, this game made the transition from one series to another a lot smoother than a lot of other games did. And the fact it's as short as it is means I can't even really be that mad at it because it's not like it's that much longer or shorter than some of the other games, at least if you take out the cutscenes. If you like classic Ninja Gaiden like I do, or Shadow of the Ninja, or even just ninja platformers in general, I'd say it's worth a playthrough. Just go in understanding that you're not going to have the most in-depth game compared to a lot of the other ones, especially at the time on other handhelds. But with that, I'm going to need to end this LP off here. Thank you guys for watching, have a great night, take care, and I'll see you guys next Let's Play, whatever that may be. See you guys then.